Corinna Hawkes a obtenu son doctorat en géographie de l'Université de Londres en 1998. Elle a commencé à évaluer les politiques alimentaires au sein d'un organisme non gouvernemental établi à Londres. Elle a ensuite travaillé aux États-Unis sur des enjeux relatifs aux politiques alimentaires communautaires. Poursuivant une carrière solidement engagée, Mme Hawkes s'est impliquée dans la mise au point de la stratégie mondiale pour l'alimentation, l'exercice physique et la santé de l'Organisation mondiale de la santé. De 2004 à 2008, elle a dirigé le programme de recherche sur les politiques alimentaires et les changements de régime alimentaire mondiaux à l'Institut international de recherche sur les politiques alimentaires à Washington. Elle était présidente de l'Expert Group on Food Marketing to Children de l'OMS et membre du Globalization Knowledge Network de la Commission des déterminants sociaux de la santé de l'OMS. Corinna Hawkes est maintenant consultante indépendante qui se spécialise dans la mise en œuvre et l'évaluation de politiques alimentaires pour contrer la tendance mondiale vers les régimes alimentaires malsains, l'obésité et les maladies chroniques liées au régime alimentaire. Ses clients à l'échelle mondiale comprennent des organismes internationaux, des organismes gouvernementaux nationaux, des fondations et des organismes non gouvernementaux. Durant sa conférence, Mme Hawkes mettra l'accent sur les marchés mondiaux de l'alimentation et le lien entre l'alimentation et la santé. For the thousands of health professionals and their partners working with individuals and communities to improve their health, the causes of bad and good health can seem very immediate. Indeed, they are. But these determinants of health have other determinants too. And while these underlying macro determinants may seem far away, they affect individuals and the work of all health professionals. This presentation will explain why and how this happens for one of the largest scale underlying determinants of health, globalization. Mrs. Hawkes, would you please?
Merci beaucoup. C'est un vrai plaisir pour moi d'être ici et merci beaucoup de me recevoir. En fait, ce matin, je voudrais parler de quelque chose qui semble très loin, très abstrait. Mais en fait, c'est proche. Elle est très présente dans notre vie quotidienne, c'est-à-dire la mondialisation. Globalization in English. Pardon, mais c'est plus facile pour moi de parler en anglais et aussi mon PowerPoint est en anglais. Mais je peux parler un peu en français si vous voudriez parler après en français. Merci. So, I'm going to talk about one aspect of globalization today, the globalization of food markets, and ask what does it mean for public health? First of all today, I want to ask, well, what is the public health problem? Let's start with the public health problem. Here is some data from the World Health Organization. What it shows is that high blood pressure is the leading risk factor for mortality. This is back in 2004. Across the world, and it's divided into high-income, middle-income, and low-income countries. Furthermore, when you combine the high blood pressure with high blood glucose, with overweight and obesity, with high cholesterol, and low fruit and vegetable intake, and then add tobacco, alcohol, and physical activity, you can explain 50% of the mortality from heart disease, which is the leading cause of death in the world. And overweight and obesity is the fifth leading cause, leading risk factor for death in the world, comprising 7% of global deaths. So according to the World Health Organization, Factors associated with what we eat are a very, very important determinant of public health. And while these figures might be a bit abstract, they've been calculated in various ways, I think many of us in our countries, in our provinces, and in our communities can see these problems, indeed even in our own families. And this is not just a problem for countries like Canada or the United States, or where I come from, the United Kingdom. It's a problem all over the world. I'm currently living in Sao Paulo, a huge, huge city in Brazil, in Latin America. And the problems are all too evident in that country, as is supported by the data. And I could show you much, much data of how these risk factors are increasing all over the world. But I want to move on to ask, well, why? These unhealthy diets, these risk factors have become a global phenomenon. Why? Theories abound. If you read the academic literature, if you talk amongst yourselves, if you read policy documents, there are lots and lots of theories about why people are eating differently. One of the most common is the McDonaldization, the Coca-Colization thesis, that fast food, soft drinks, snacks are everywhere. Everywhere we go in the world, we see these products. They're everywhere, they're easy to access. There's another whole kind of body of theory, if you like, around meat. Some people really do lay the blame for these problems on increased meat consumption as a result of vast increases in meat production. And another issue is that food has become relatively cheap. Our housing is still expensive. Some consumer goods are still expensive. In many countries, people have to pay for education and healthcare. That's expensive too. But food relative to that is cheap. And moreover, there is a theory that the cost per calorie of energy-dense foods has declined, so it's easier, particularly if you're on a low income, to buy energy-dense foods because it's going to make your calories last a longer time. That's another theory. And another theory popularized by Brian Rossink, if you've read his book Mindless Eating in the US, is that everywhere we go there's food. When we go out, there's a vending machine. Into the street, there's food everywhere. When we go into a restaurant, they put bread on the table. All these stimuli in our environment, always encouraging us to eat, eat, eat. And of course, there's the issue of food marketing to children, in which we see that fatty, sugary, and high-calorie food is aggressively promoted. Less so in Quebec, but certainly throughout the world, the promotion is very aggressive, including in countries such as Brazil. So let's have a look at these theories then. Now, if you look at them, it becomes clear that these theories are focused on the environment, the food environment. And they're divided into theories about availability of food, about prices of food, and about the marketing of food. So there's a whole set of theories that says the reason that we're eating less healthy diets is because the food environment has changed. But there are more theories out there too. One of the most important is that people are simply wealthier. They live in cities, they have more money, but they don't have any time. So they want to go out and spend on convenience foods. Children also have more spending power. You may have seen some of the figures about the billions of dollars that are attributed to the child market in the world today, which was not the case 20 years ago. But of course, many people have a limited income. There's a great inequality in income, which means that some people are not able to afford certain foods. And then there's another lot of theories. Look, it's just us. It's just who we are. When we're born, we like sweet things. And we like variety. We don't want to be eating the same savory things all the time. We like palatable foods. It's part of who we are as a species. So we demand them from the food system. Another issue that is particularly obvious in a country that I'm living in now and developing nations is that people want what other people have. So when they see that the mainstream of people can afford to access these foods, they want that too. That's another theory, particularly in developing countries, when they see Western people consuming these foods and they assume that it's better and say, I want to eat that too. It's a particular issue in developing nations. And of course, for all of us, another theory is that the reason why obesity has become a problem, as well as eating disorders in general, is that people look to food for emotional fulfillment. Communities have collapsed. That we don't have our social support networks the way that we used to once before. So people look to food for emotional fulfillment, and they eat too much of the wrong foods. So here are some more theories. If you look at these theories about us. They're theories about consumers. It's the consumer's fault for demanding these foods from the food supply chain. So these theories emphasize that consumers have changed. And that's why we're eating differently. And that's because of their changed ability to consume and a changed willingness to consume. Now, what I want to talk about today is something that unifies these two very different approaches, which can be very divisive in public health, about whether the problem is the cause of the big determinant or whether the problem is the people. And that is that the globalizations of food markets has altered the nature of the food supply, thereby altering the food environment in which we live and the nature of us as consumers. And it's this collision which has changed the way that we eat. Now, I just want to go over briefly what is globalization. This may be familiar or not to you. I just want to be clear about what I'm talking about when I'm talking about globalization. Now, I see the start of the kind of globalization era really being at the beginning of the 1980s, though it really got going in the late to late 70s, and of course it's still going on today. Now, when we think about globalization, I think often we think of the international flow of products and technologies, information services, money, going across borders. That's been going on for thousands of years, particularly with the case of products. What the difference about what happened in the 1980s was the integration of national economies into the global economy. So I'm talking about it really from an economic perspective, even though there were very important cultural aspects to it as well. And what that integration led to is that if you're sitting in a government, in a nation, and you have to make decisions about how to manage your economy and about how to run your nation, you have to increasingly consider global conditions, and you have to increasingly consider decisions made by people in other countries. So it leads to greater interdependence. It doesn't, some people say it takes away our nation states. It doesn't. The nation state is still powerful and is still the one who makes decisions, as in provinces and at the local level, also decision makers. But the point is that those decisions have to take into account global conditions to a greater extent. Globalization did not happen as an inevitable accident of history. It was put into place through specific policies. It's a very specific policy decision. It started in developing nations with structural adjustment, which I won't go into, but the main issue and the main policy mechanism is trade agreements. And of course, Canada has one of the most open trade agreements with the United States and Mexico, the North American Free Trade Agreements signed in 1994. There were other mechanisms to investment treaties, privatization, harmonization of regulations, and so on. The point is that these are clear policies that have been put into place to drive globalization. Now let's move specifically to talk about food markets. I've identified 3 key policies and processes that have globalized food markets, or altered the nature of food markets. Let me give you some examples. Foreign direct investment is very, very important. That's when a company, a person, an enterprise from another country would say invests and buys a company in, say, Canada. So this is how you make transnational corporations. And I give the example from Canada simply because I'm here, in that the North American Free Trade Agreement eliminated the rule that was in place in which, say in Mexico, you weren't allowed to have a foreign company be the majority shareholder, the majority owner of a company in Mexico. NAFTA changed that. And what happened was that money flowed in from the United States, from the large food manufacturers there, and it really changed the nature of the processed food market in Mexico. And we also see money coming into Canada as a result of that, though that was mainly into grain processing. So you can see how this policy change really shook up the markets and changed them in important ways. The second set of policies are those which make a better business environment for private companies. So you've got laws on international intellectual property rights, laws on dispute resolution, laws on the trade and services, and so on, which create a better and less risky business environment, which encourage private traders to come and do business. It's very interesting. I find that in 2004, the United Nations said that food companies were the most transnationalized of any business sector, the others being chemicals and cars. And what we've seen as a result is this tremendous growth of private companies that have tremendous power in the food system. Look at this. We have seed companies, we have processed packaged food companies, we have retailers, we have advertising agencies, all merging and becoming more and more powerful. Very important dynamic in food markets. Now, the really complicated bit is agricultural trade liberalisation. Trade liberalisation is really a central component of globalisation, and indeed has been central in the changes that we've seen in agricultural and food markets over the past 30 years. It really represents a powerful paradigm shift. Before, there was an idea that the nation state produces food for itself. Moreover, maybe a province produces food itself, a local area produces food for itself, and the state has a role in supporting production. There was a complete paradigm shift to the idea that that's not how agricultural markets should work. We should remove the state and move to efficient private global markets to meet demand from consumers, because it's inefficient to support producers and they produce things that consumers don't want. We make it consumer-driven, and we make it global. So it means that if Canada's good at growing wheat, they grow wheat. And if the US is good at growing corn, they grow corn, and then they trade between them. However, what's very, very important here is that this idea has only been partially implemented. There's been removal of subsidies, trade barriers, privatization, and so on, but in fact, there's still lots of state support of agriculture, so this makes it very complicated. But one of the very clear outcomes of this has been a change in imports and exports. There's been an incredible increase of imports into developing countries from developed nations. But here we see the imports of avocados and grapes and out-of-season fruits and particular types of fish coming from poorer to richer nations. And we see an increase in the amount of processed foods which are traded relative to cereals. Now, my point of this slide here is really just to show that these processes have affected the dynamics of the whole food supply chain, which I've depicted here on the slide. People have moved off the farm and become consumers. And value has moved off the farm into the food consuming industries, the retailers, the distributors, the processors, and so on. This has changed the competitive pressures in the food supply chain. It's given a certain amount of power to consumers, meaning the final consumer, us, as well as the food consuming industry. And it's put new pressures on agriculture. The point that I'm making here is that these dynamics have then affected the food environment, and this is where the public health comes in. So let's just look at these changes to the food environment. The first change is availability. Calorie availability per capita has gone up since the beginning of the globalizing project, that you can see different countries represented here. But much more interesting than calories is that some foods have become more available than others. This example is of processed foods. So you see the value growth of highly processed foods between 2002 and 2005. This is the best data I could get. But what you see is that certain processed foods have risen faster than others. So there's a powerful difference within the food groups. And here it shows that snack bars in particular is growing at a particularly rapid rate. Now I could show you similar slides for fats and for meats. But one of the things that when you start looking at this is you realize that there is significant difference between countries. And there's a significant difference within food groups. Again, I've just given Canada because I'm here. I could have done this for other countries also. What I did was, as I plotted using very basic data from the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN, which gives data on the amount of calories, where calories come from for consumption. It's not actual consumption data, so it's quite crude. But what I did was say, well, what's the difference in how is the percentage of calories, where are the percentage of calories coming from, and how has it changed between 1982 and 2002? And you can see on the left here that cereals have actually gone up, meats have gone down, animal fats have gone down, vegetable oils, sorry, it's cut off, vegetable oils have gone up, and milk has gone down. You think, well, okay. Now you look more closely, and you find that the increase in cereal can be explained by an increase in corn consumption. And then you think, well, hang on, why is this corn consumption? And you can go back and you look at NAFTA and you realize that the changes under NAFTA led and stimulated an incredible increase of imports in corn from the United States into Canada. Now, I'm giving this example from Canada because I'm here, but I could do this for many, many other countries, and you find this pattern, that availability is directly affected by these policies that are put into place from globalization. Maybe that explains why, in fact, meat consumption or the meat available for consumption may have gone down a bit in Canada, but this is explained by beef. In fact, chicken consumption has gone up. This is a pattern we see all over the world. And this perhaps may be because of the animal feed that the corn used to feed chicken. I'm not sure of the exact dynamics in Canada, but in other countries, what we see is that increased imports of corn, increased imports of animal feed stimulate the production of intensive chicken production, and it really, really has an effect on the price and increases availability. So then we look at sugar. Well, on the first graph on the left, there appeared to be no significant change in the calories available from sugar. But when you break it down within food groups, you see that the amount of calories coming from sweeteners has gone up, the amount coming from sugar has gone down. Sweeteners are made from corn. They are used in soft drinks, and milk consumption has declined. So you can begin to understand why these things we all complain about in public health are affected by these very big policies in our macro environment. Now, the third aspect of availability that has changed is simply more choice. There are thousands and thousands of foods on our supermarket shelves. So we see changing availability in terms of calories, in terms of the food and within food groups that are available, and just in the sheer range of choice of products that may be very, very similar, but are differentiated from each other in some way, as the retailers and processors compete for our dollars. Now let me move into prices. One of the very important aspects here is this switch to lower price substitutes. What's happened with globalization is that companies can source ingredients from wherever they like. It's much easier, there are a lot less costs in the way of going around the world and saying, where can I get the lowest cost ingredient? That combined with technology and other changes that I just referred to has changed the price of ingredients at the farm. So that means that livestock producers can buy corn rather than wheat, which is more expensive. So they can produce meat at a lower price. It means that processors making soft drinks or processed foods can buy corn sweetener rather than sugar, because it's less expensive. But it also means that we switch too. Because sugar and flour may be not expensive, But because cookies and other and biscuits can be produced at such lower cost by the processors, it means, well, why do we bother making cookies when we can just buy them? So we substitute too. And of course, this, I think, is one explanation of why chicken has become so much more important in our diets relative to beef. The ability to access lower price substitutes lowers the costs for processors. So the amount of money that they have to spend on ingredients is lower. This means that they can either pass on lower costs to the consumers, which means cheaper food, which means perhaps they buy more, or maybe they keep it for themselves and invest it in product innovation, which again stimulates consumer demand, or they just keep it as profit. In other words, it increases their incentive to grow as a business. It increases their incentive to produce. It also lowers cost to retailers. Retailers are so powerful these days that they can say to farmers and other producers, look, we're not going to pay so much for your products. And so that enables them to compete hard for the consumer dollar. So they compete very, very fiercely with each other on the basis of price. And they're able to do that because they're able to cut their costs out of their supply chain. Now, there's a second very important dynamic when it comes to price as well. That price is used increasingly as a marketing tool. Sometime in the past, price was a reflection of what it costs to produce on the farm. Then you add in the cost of labor, the cost of putting it into a shop, and then you sell it. That's no longer the case. Some foods, foods may be priced high or lower. Their margins will be very, very different depending on how it appeals to different consumers. So it's used as a marketing tool, and the cutting costs earlier on in the supply chain has allowed retailers and processors to do that, giving them that flexibility. So now I move on to marketing. As I said before, the value and power has moved off the farm towards the consumers. That means the food consuming industries, but it means they have to compete hard for the foods that we buy. And marketing is the way that they do that. It's much, much more than communications. I'm not just talking about promotion. This photo you see here is a photo I took last week in my local supermarket in Sao Paulo, which is a supermarket targeted at a middle to upper income consumer. And I wanted to use it as an example to show what I mean by this incredibly sophisticated marketing that goes on, that goes way beyond just promotion. It's a photo of the front of the store with some grapes, if you can see the photo. And if you see behind, you can see the grape juice. So they've put those together on that stand to appeal to different consumers. Both the consumer who wants to buy the fruit and vegetable, but then the value added. They've added value onto that product by making the grape juice. And that appeals to the consumer who knows that they should eat grapes, but doesn't really like them. So it's a way of targeting different people in different ways. Place is another important aspect of marketing. Place can mean, for example, that these fruits and vegetables are in the supermarket at all. They're also sold at street markets and on street corners and in vans. So where things are actually retailed, such as Coca-Cola being sold in every tiny, tiny little store all over the world, is an example of place. But place is also important where it's actually positioned in the retail store as well. And that's why I took this photo, is that you can see below there are little Easter eggs with Easter approaching. Kinder, I don't know whether you have this product in Canada, but the Kinder egg is positioned right there. And if you see the supermarket trolley, that was my supermarket trolley. And I was with my young daughter, and that's the special checkout for people with young children in Brazil. They're very child-friendly. They have checkout especially for young children and for older people and so on. And so they put that directly where I was with my young child and all the other people are with their young child at their height. So this is the importance of place. It doesn't matter that it's right next to the fruits and vegetables because that's targeted at a different consumer. And packaging is also important. You can see that these packaging is clearly very attractive to children. But it's not just about cartoons on packaging and bright packaging. Look at the grapes. The grapes are wrapped up. For the middle to upper income consumer in Brazil, that represents quality. That's much better than going to the street market where everybody goes and buying fruits and vegetables. It's better and it's safer to have a wrapped product. That's how people receive it. And for the supermarket, it's good because they can charge more than if they were unwrapped, because people are prepared to pay the added value. And so that's where price comes in. When it comes to promotion, you can see that there's a sales promotion that comes with the eggs there. But public relations is also a very important part of marketing. You can see a green sign in front of the grape juice and the grapes. That green sign explains how good it is to eat fruits and vegetables. That's a good thing. But this particular supermarket is positioning itself in the Brazilian market. It's, by the way, it's a French supermarket who own this particular supermarket, are positioning themselves as a healthy supermarket. They've just produced a whole new product line which is low in fat and so on. They sponsor sports events. They are generating an image for themselves as a healthy company, which is important for the middle to upper-income consumer in Sao Paulo. And so this is part of it. It's part of saying, we're a healthy company, and therefore gaining public relations benefits. Obviously, there are good sides also. So this is you can see that the changes in food markets have really radically changed food availability, food prices, and food marketing in all kinds of different ways. I've tried to give some general points and point out that there are lots of specific variations also. The point is, there's been this very important change. So you think there's been this huge change in the food environment. People are eating too much, they're eating too much of the wrong foods. Sure. Well, you think of it from a policy perspective, you think you just have to change the environment. So, for example, if you're living in a food desert, if you're living in an area with no access to fruits and vegetables, but you like fruits and vegetables, you want them, you go and put a market in there, everybody's happy. Unfortunately, while this is critical, it's not so simple. If it was that simple, we could simply change what was on the shelves, change their prices, and everybody would be happy with it. I think we know from examples, for example, in my country, in the United Kingdom, there's been real challenges implementing school meal standards because the children are used to other foods, and you just change food availability, and they're not so happy. It requires more than just changing the food environment. And this is where the consumer comes in. Because the consumer does have agency in this process. Now, forgive me for producing a slide which is full of lines and boxes. But the point I'm trying to make here is that the changes in the food environment interact with changes in consumers. And moreover, the policies of the globalizing era, as they've affected the food supply chain and food markets, itself has had an important effect on the nature of us as consumers. So, firstly, the food environment changes. Secondly, globalization has had an important impact on economies, on personal income. It's encouraged the spread of credit, which is very important. It's encouraged urbanization, and this is something which is really kind of not really disputed, which is that it's also associated with increasing income inequality, while it's associated with increasing income, also inequality. And this has changed our ability to consume. It means the foods are available at certain prices, but now more people are able to afford them, or more people are not able to afford them, but would like them and are willing to eat substitutes, as I was referring to earlier. So the ability to consume has changed as well, along with globalization. But what's also changed is the willingness to consume. What basically has happened is three things. One is that globalization has created consumers. People have gone off the land. They're more alienated from their work, and they define themselves by their acts as consumers. So globalization has created consumers. And secondly, it has said that consumers are necessary for this system to work. Food markets would fail if consumers didn't buy. So it has not only created consumers, but it requires consumers in order to exist. Consumption in itself has become an important part of economic development. We consume our way out of crises. Thirdly, processors and retailers have created an amazing array of choice that gives the impression of unlimited choice, that we can go in and we can choose and choose and choose. And the marketing is targeted at each one of us so cleverly that it makes us think there's always a product for us, there's always a product for us. So it's given this environment of choice. And this has created this culture of consumer choice. And when I say a culture of consumer choice, what I mean is if I was to say to you, you know, I think we should have less choice. This is crazy, what less choice? Because it's really become an ideology, it's really become part of our culture that choice is a good thing. It didn't always used to be that way. So what's happened is it's created this incredible willingness to consume, a desire to consume. And when you combine that with the ability to consume, the people who are able to consume, they have the money to consume and the credit to consume, they will then go out and consume more and more and more, and they will exercise their choice. Now, the people who can't do that, the people who are marginalized, the people who are poor, will want to do that. They'll be frustrated in the fact they don't feel, I hear this in Brazil all the time, that people who live in favelas, they want to be part of mainstream society. And one of the ways of expressing this is to consume the foods that other people consume. So it becomes part and parcel of being part of society to be this consumer. And then on top of that, you have this affects the willingness to consume, the desire to consume. Then on top of that, of course, you've got the food marketing, which is feeding that. So what you have here is this collision between these changes in the food environment, the changes in the ability to consume, the changes in our willingness to consume as societies all over the world. And the question becomes not why do we eat differently, but why on earth would we not eat differently? The policies themselves were not inevitable. The policies were chosen. The processes were not inevitable. But the outcome is inevitable, that we would eat differently. So the question for someone like me who works in food policy then is what do we do about it? And I'm not going to continue that now because that's the theme of what I'm going to be talking about at the session tomorrow. But I would just like to briefly say, what can we learn from this? I'd like to make two general points initially. First of all, remember that our local experiences are a reflect of global realities. We're not alone. The problems that we have in public health more generally, and globalization affects all aspects of public health, I've just talked about one of them, is affecting people all over the world. We're not alone. But one of my key messages is that we have to recognize that our work in public health benefits from understanding the broader determinants of health. It's worth investing some time into understanding global food markets. It's worth us thinking about these connections, because not only does it connect us with other people, but it helps us put our work into context and to think, and this is specific to food, this point, we can improve our food environment by intervening in the food supply chain. We can and we should, and I'll be talking about that at much greater length tomorrow. But while we keep that in mind, we also need to remember that the food cultures of different groups matters too. That globalization is not happening in a vacuum. I think one of the reasons that it's had such different impacts in different countries when it comes to consumption is because of the different existing food cultures. And these food cultures need to be taken into account, but in the context of the fact that we're all living today in this dominant culture of consumer choice. Thank you very much.
Merci infiniment, Madame Hawkes. Quelques minutes avant votre présentation, vous me disiez craindre de ne pas rejoindre l'intérêt de l'ensemble des participants aux journées annuelles de santé publique de ce matin. Je peux vous rassurer tout de suite, votre propos de mondialisation des marchés de l'alimentation rejoint certainement nous tous en santé publique et nous tous aussi dans notre vie sommes concernés, vous l'avez bien démontré, par cette réalité. Je vais inviter le public dans la salle à vous adresser quelques questions car nous avons un peu de temps et même un peu plus que d'habitude. Alors, on va en profiter. Mais pendant que les gens se présentent au micro, moi, j'ai vraiment le goût de vous poser la question suivante. Vous savez que les autorités de santé publique et nous sommes des gens de santé publique, sommes concernés. Nous avons des plans d'action qui visent à faire en sorte que l'environnement agroalimentaire soit un environnement agroalimentaire qui facilite les choix sains, qui favorise les choix alimentaires sains. Qu'attendez-vous des autorités de santé publique du Québec, du Canada et d'ailleurs dans le monde en termes de leadership pour contrer les méfaits, je dirais, associés à la mondialisation des marchés de l'alimentation? Si vous voulez revenir au micro. What do you expect from public health authorities to act against the problems of globalizations in the domain of agroalimentary? Okay. Ça, c'est difficile quand on ne parle pas bien anglais.
Non,
parle mieux français que moi, je parle anglais.
Quand je pense en anglais, mon français, c'est pas dans ma tête, pardon. Je comprends. The first thing that people in public health have to do and policymakers is to understand, is to engage with globalization and not think it's something that's so far away. And that hasn't really been done, I think, to a sufficient degree. So first of all, they have to understand that it's important and then engage and try and learn about the effect that it's having. The second thing they need to do is be very practical. When it comes to food, is they identify a problem. Maybe it's the consumption of soft drinks, maybe it's the consumption of meat or whatever, and say, okay, this is the problem. This is an eating problem. Is it affected in any way by the policies and processes of globalization or the policies and processes in food markets? And if so, what can we do about it? That's a very practical point, and I'll be talking more about that tomorrow. The third point is to really try and forge an international alliances that are effective from a public health standpoint. And I say that quite slowly and carefully because the World Health Organization is not the most important public health body internationally. It's an extremely important organization that does a lot of very good work. But I would argue there is a crisis in global health governance, and many others argue this too, that the way that health is governed at an international level isn't satisfactory. And it's not helping nations and local regions as much as it should. But to fix it, you have to have engagement from national and provincial public health policymakers at the international level to try and say, what kind of governance do we need at an international level? And once we've got that governance, then we can start addressing the issues associated with globalization much more effectively. So I think the most crucial thing to do is to get a global health governance, engage in developing a good structure for global health governance.
Alors, vous avez des questions. D'ici, on voit assez mal à cause des lumières. Alors, vous présentez au micro, vous présentez. Il y a quelqu'un? Oui, on vous écoute. Mettez donc vos appareils pour pas que les gens dans l'auditoire aient le même problème que moi. Vous pouvez poser vos questions en français ou en anglais.
You can take them off. I'm going to ask my question in English. My name is Jean-Pierre Courtois. I'm a public health physician. I'd like to hear you on the transportation aspects. The way globalization is happening on the planet implies that the whole planet is crisscrossed by millions and millions of trucks and ships and containers going from country to country, and of course a large consumption of oil. And I'm wondering if somewhere down the line, the change that we're hoping for is not going to be helped by the fact that oil will become more costly. And so how does the transportation factor, how does that lead us in terms of prognosis regarding globalization of food?
Thanks for that question. One of the things I didn't talk about in my talk, just through time limitation, was technology and transportation. Technology has been a huge influence on globalization. I talked about policies. Policies are important because they encourage the adoption of technology, but of course it required the development of technology. And transport is one important part of that technological revolution. And it's absolutely, I mean, I talked about prices, and I was focused on some very specific issues to keep the messages clear and simple enough. But one of the major reasons why food prices have come down is because of the reduced cost of transportation. You see this throughout history, in fact. So transportation really has been immensely important, and so I'm very glad that you raised it. And it also allows me to say something that I wanted to say, but didn't bring it into my presentation, which is about what's actually going to be the tipping points for saying this system is not sustainable from lots of different perspectives. You can argue it's not sustainable because it's encouraging unhealthy eating, which is in turn associated with a terrible public health burden. But there's also the argument that it's not actually sustainable from an environmental perspective, and with all these issues around oil and so on. And I think what's really interesting now is that when I'm talking at sessions and talking with people about globalization, that a lot of the issues are discussed in an environmental context. So the idea is that what is a healthy food supply is healthy for us as people, as eaters, but also healthy for the environment. And I think that the whole issue around transportation and oil is going to be a very important pressure point in altering that system. And I talked about the importance of having global health governance that functions in response to the earlier question. But one of the reasons I think that global health governance isn't operating as effectively as it should is because it's too compartmentalized. And so it's not talking enough with people with other concerns, because one of the things that globalization does, it brings everything together and makes problems even more interactive than they were before. But that, of course, means that there's also much more opportunities to join forces with people who are concerned about globalization for other reasons, such as the environment, to create change.
Bonjour, Ms. Hawkes, if you don't mind, I will ask you the question in French. Mon nom est Mario Corbeil, je suis de la direction de la santé publique en Outaouais. J'aimerais vous poser une question en lien avec la production locale. Je sais que vous parlez vraiment de globalisation globale. Dans mon cas, je travaille dans une région et à ce moment-là, quand on parle de mondialisation, de globalisation des marchés, on se sent un peu démuni devant cette machine énorme. Et ce qu'on tente de faire, c'est de travailler plus avec des producteurs locaux. Et j'aimerais vous entendre parler un peu, qu'est-ce que vous pensez de cette idée, même si c'est seulement une portion infime de l'offre alimentaire, de travailler avec des producteurs locaux. Qu'est-ce que vous en pensez? Quelles sont vos réflexions en lien avec ce type d'intervention?
Thank you very much for that question. I'll be talking about this issue of local production tomorrow in the session. Thanks for raising the issue. I think what's important is competition. We live in a world where the economies are characterized by certain different types of competition. And in my area, often the talk is about how we can work with retailers and particularly food processors to create change. I think competition is very important, and I think local markets are an extremely important form of competition. because they're created from a different place. They're not coming from the top, they're coming from the bottom. And I think they have an incredibly important role to play for two reasons. One is that they create a market for foods which people feel they have ownership with, and it affects this kind of culture of consumption. I think the local food market movement is a bit counter to this whole culture of consumption, this culture of choice, and more about the relationship between the producer and the consumer. What globalization has done is change the relationship between producers and consumers. I think local markets are changing, yet again, they're not going back, they're changing it in a way which is quite profound. So people say, well, they're great because they sell healthy food, fruits and vegetables, and that's true. I think they're also very important because they're also talking about the culture of consumption and the link between producers and consumers. So for me, they're critical. From that perspective. And the second reason I think they're important is because they're genuinely competitive with food retailers and food processors. Because I think that one of the things that I see all over the world and that has been written about is that consumers still identify naturalness and healthfulness with back to the land. It's something inside us. You see it everywhere. And that means that increasingly food processors are using labels with nice flowers on. They're allowing farmers markets to open up in their parking lots. They're doing things that make them associated with agriculture because they actually see this. The local markets is a serious threat. And so I think that is a sign that these things are very serious. And the issue is how to scale this up. I have to say I'm a great supporter of local markets for those two reasons.
Thank you.
Dernière question.
Bonjour, Manon Toupin, je travaille en santé publique. J'aimerais connaître votre opinion concernant, en fait, ce qu'on entend un peu plus souvent maintenant, de toxic food, la qualité des aliments. On parle, les fruits et légumes, moins de vitamines, les pesticides, les herbicides. Donc, j'aimerais connaître votre opinion. Merci.
Again, thank you very much for that very good question. The issue around toxicity is one which is interesting because it combines a genuine scientific concern about the toxins in food, but also with a feeling which is not so scientific, but which is inside us for consumers, that we don't want to take those kinds of risks. I think that particularly comes out with children's food, with the growth of organic market and so on. For children, that we don't want to, we feel uneasy. We feel uneasy about these toxins, even though scientifically the scientists tell us that they're safe at the levels that they are in our food. And I think that goes back to what I said earlier, that there is this a desire for more local markets over which we feel we have no more control. What's happened with globalization is that things have got further away, and we just feel uneasy about what are these products, where are they coming from? And of course, another aspect of the technological component of globalization has been the breeding of plants, of new food crops and new animals, which has changed the vitamin content of those plants. The systematic reviews that have been conducted do suggest that, and also change the fat content, the fatty acid content of meats. So I think this is how the actual public health impact, it's difficult to measure, but that these effects are going on is definitely the case. And I think from a consumer perception point of view, represents an opportunity to try and say, to try and build markets for healthier diets in which consumers feel that they can trust. As I said, the food processors, the food retailers try and build trust with consumers. And they do this by talking about naturalness and so on. But I think there's a case for trying to have a greater trust in the food system in a market in which consumers do feel more connected with and that they have more control of. And I think that applies to toxicity. Sorry, that was a slightly confused answer.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup encore. Merci de votre participation. Une petite consigne de dernière minute. Contrairement à ce qui est indiqué sur le feuillet, la journée « Le contenu de l'assiette des Québécois à la connaître pour mieux agir » se déroulera dans la salle Mackenzie. Et la journée « Implanter des interventions éprouvées en promotion de la santé mentale » se retrouve dans la salle du Lutte. Alors voilà, bonne journée à tous.